Hello, welcome back to Jorbs Talks About Every Card in the Slay the Spire Compendium. Working our way through the Ironclad Uncommons right now. I want to talk about Disarm. We're joined by Zephyr today. I don't know if you can see him, it's a very dark cat hanging out on my lap. Disarm is a very interesting card because it uniquely uncaps something that Ironclad can do. In like specifically the Book of Stabbing fight or against Awakened one, Disarm, if you have a couple of Disarm pluses, can sort of make the enemy not deal damage to you most of the time, which is unusual. Same with the enemy that deals 8 times 3 damage to you 2 out of 3 turns in the Act 2 Holy fights. Yeah, and more broadly, I guess, Disarms in multiples can do this in a few other fights in the game, but most enemies tend to deal more damage to you as the fight goes on, or just deal a lump amount of damage to you that's large enough that bringing it down to nearly 0 isn't really conceivable with Disarm. But when you have a card that does that, it lets you do some quirky things, like even a deck which is very, very slow and not well put together yet might be able to scale strength to a tremendously large number and then play Reaper to full heal, for example. So this is a card with very high potential in a few places, which makes it a cool card to have. It has block over time, which is something that Ironclad doesn't have that much of, and it can also have very, very, very large amounts of block over time in certain fights where enemies are attacking you multiple times per turn. Book of Stabbing, the Heart, stuff like that. And so it's always going to be okay in almost every situation in a run, but it's going to be really incredible in a few situations. One of the big things that helps this card be okay in most situations in the run is its exhaust synergies. If you have a Feel No Pain, if you have a Dark Embrace, if you have a Corruption, if you have an Exhume, all of these things make Disarm a little bit more powerful, and you're typically going to want to be picking up cards like that, at least one of them per run, if your deck is an Ironclad deck. It doesn't really matter how your deck's trying to win, those cards are almost certainly going to be worth picking up if you see them every now and then. So, because of that, Disarm ends up being a card which you can find reasons to take if you're looking for them, but you can also definitely choose not to take this card or to take a different card which is more important early on in the run, because this is not a card that's particularly good against Gremlin Knob or Sentries or Lagavulin. It's fine against Hexaghost and Guardian, but I would say it's generally not needed against Hexaghost or Guardian. The way that you win the Hexaghost and Guardian fights is not typically reliant on having a Disarm. Late game, in the Boss Gauntlet against Awaken 1 Time Eater and the Heart in particular, Disarm can be a very, very powerful card. So one reason you might want to find to pick it up, even though it's only going to be okay in most fights, is to make sure that your deck's ability to beat late game goes up by enough to do solidly in late game. Without talking about every rule mechanically in the entire game, I think when we're looking at Disarm, it's worth talking about interactions with minus strength cleansing. So the way that strength works is, say an enemy gains some strength, it's going to have, say, +8 strength. If you give it minus strength, if you give it -2 strength, it goes to having +6 strength. And if it then does something that cleanses all of its strength debuffs, or all of its debuffs in general, it'll still only have +6 strength, because it doesn't recognize that there was a debuff there. The debuff is lost because strength is remembered as one number, not as how much strength is buffed plus how much strength is debuffed. On the other hand, if you have an enemy that has 0 strength right now, and you put it to -2 strength, and then it cleanses negative strength, it's going to go up to 0 strength. And this is a particularly important thing to recognize at times in the Time Eater, Champ, Awakened One, and Heart fights. All of these are fights where your enemy cleanses negative strength at some point in the fight. The Heart cleanses negative strength on turn 4, 7, 10, 13, etc. Awakened One cleanses negative strength during the transformation between stage 1 and stage 2. The Champ cleanses negative strength in the transformation from above half health to below half health, and so does the Time Meter. So because of that, when you have a card that makes an enemy lose strength, sometimes you want to let that enemy gain a little bit of strength before you play it, or you want to wait until after they cleanse their negative strength before you play it. The Heart starts with 2 strength, for example. So it's at the start of the fight, the Heart has... Does the Heart have 0 strength at the start of the fight, actually? See, you should look this up and find out for sure. Anyway, the Heart has some amount of strength at the start of the fight. Maybe it's 0, maybe it's 2, I don't know. And the problem is that on turn 4, it's going to gain +2 strength, and it's going to cleanse negative strength. And if you would like its attack on turn 5 or 6 for 15 times to not kill you, what this means is that if you have like Runic Pyramid or something like that, some ability to choose when you're playing Disarm, it may be correct to not play your Disarm until after turn 4. Or if you have 2 Disarms, you might want to play 1 on turn 1 in order to deal with the multi-attack when you're vulnerable. Then not play 1 on turn 5 or 6 because the attacks aren't that threatening. Let it cleanse negative strength there, and then play your second one on turn 7. On turn 8, actually. In order to get the maximal strength reduction out of your card. These are just things to be watching out for with enemies who's cleansing negative strength. We'll talk about this more when we look at cards like Piercing Wail and Malaise, I'm pretty sure. But I felt like it was worth mentioning with Disarm because I see a lot of people suggest playing Disarm in a way that's wrong in the Heart fight. When I'm navigating Heart fights with Disarm, you often do not want to play Disarm yet against the Heart because you want to wait until the next time it cleanses negative strength. Now if the Heart has 3 strength at the moment, for whatever reason, go ahead and play Disarm Plus and put it to 0 strength, no problem, you're not going to have any of that cleansed. But if the Heart is at 0 strength and you play Disarm, then it's just going to immediately cleanse the negative strength before it buffs its strength and your Disarm is gone. And if it's at 2 strength, then playing Disarm will put it at -1, so it does help you out. It basically removes 2 strength for the rest of the fight, but that extra 3rd strength removal is going to get cleansed by the strength down debuff. Remove strength down debuff function that the Heart has on turn 4, 7, 10, 13, and then you'll lose that. So just keep it in mind. Work out what you want to do with it. It's a tricky thing to be thinking about for sure. And yeah, that's Disarm. It's a good card. It's a good solid defensive Ironclad card. If you're looking at an Ironclad deck and it doesn't look like it's defending itself very well in fights, Disarm is often going to be great for helping you out. I guess one last thing that I'll mention is if you have like a couple of Disarms in your Ironclad deck going through Act 2, that massively changes which fights are hard. Your 8x3 attacking enemy fight, not hard anymore. Book of Stabbing, not hard anymore. And so because of that, you have to recognize which fights are now the hard ones and build appropriately for them. if my deck has Disarm in it, Whirlwind gets better, because I'm very good at killing single enemy fights, since my debuff hits them so well. Single enemies tend to multi-attack you to make up for the fact there's only one of them in the fight, so not only is Disarm hitting every enemy in the fight since there's only one, but also it's perhaps having multiplicative effect against that enemy because it's attacking more than one time. On the other hand, against Slavers, Disarm is very bad. So taking cards that are good in the fights where Disarm is bad makes sense if you have Disarms. Or making sure that you have potions for those fights, or relics that help you in those fights, whatever it may be. But thinking constantly about which fights you could face and making sure that you have them under control is an important way to think about playing Slay the Spire. And Disarm is going to make it so quite a few fights are under control, or at least a lot closer to being under control than they were before. And it will leave you in your like mental checklist with a smaller set of fights which are still out of control, which become a higher priority to fix because you have quite a few of the fights already dealt with. All right. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.